real spaces where there is the possibility of coming together collectively and thinking critically about these issues. So thank you so much for letting me be part of this great initiative. Um, I have to apologize to the audience. I have had till now a very good experience with technology, whether it's Zoom, whether it's MS Teams. And today, unfortunately, for some strange reason, I was not able to log into Zoom with my laptop. So I'm talking to you with my handheld smartphone. And I was telling Maria earlier that I tend to talk with my hands. So I'm going to be a little less animated than usual. And I'm going to also depend on, I think, Maria and her team to help me navigate my laptop, PowerPoint. So let me, because I have about, Maria, am I right? I have about 20 minutes?
A little bit, yeah, around 20 minutes. Yeah, sorry,
right, so,
sorry for interrupting. Just to let everybody know that we are recording the session, okay?
Okay, thank you, Maria. So I have about 20 minutes. And what I'm going to do is, because as far as I understood, it was the expectation was it would be a heterogeneous audience. So I'm going to kind of, in the first 5 to 7 minutes, give a basic insight into the three key concepts that are in the title of my talk: intersectionality, diversity, and global justice, and how they are related to each other. And then in the last 10-12 minutes, I'll talk about the limitations and critique also of these progressive ideas and concepts, and see how we can kind of negotiate the enabling but also the limiting aspects of these concepts. So let me start with, I think, one of the key questions for post-colonial queer feminist scholarship, which is, what difference does difference make? And I think that this is such a key question because, on the one hand, feminism has been about equality. It has been about um, it's been about inclusion. It's been about giving voice to those who've been silenced. It has been about empowering those who've been dispossessed. So it's also the aspiration of feminism has been equality, sameness. But at the same time, it has been argued by post-colonial, decolonial, queer, third world feminists that the epistemological framework and theoretical categories of so-called mainstream feminist scholarship, whatever mainstream, we can have a discussion around what we understand by mainstream scholarship. But here, of course, because I speak from a post-colonial queer feminist perspective, the critique is that Western feminism has not adequately, when talking about autonomy, emancipation, freedom, has not adequately acknowledged and considered the experiences of different subject positions. So, the much touted claim of global sisterhood and universal patriarchy somehow presumes that sexism is a universal trans-historical phenomena, that all women are victims of male violence, or all um, queer people globally, irrespective of whatever their social, political, economic, cultural position, have somehow common experiences. And it's argued that when it comes to racism, class bias, imperialism, um, we need a kind of a corrective methodology. And this is provided by, there is an effort by diversity studies, by intersectionality studies, and social justice studies. Each of them make an effort to somehow do a multi-directional critique by acknowledging the plurality of categories that need to be considered when we aspire for a less exclusionary and more just feminist scholarship and activism. So I come to the three key concepts, and of course, everybody's familiar with it, with the concept of diversity. But I just once again wanted to emphasize that, on the one hand, diversity studies is, of course, associated with the corporate world, and how diversity first, if one does a genealogical analysis of diversity, it is linked to, particularly advertising agencies, marketing agencies. They argued that if you put in, I mean, they did these kinds of experiments where they had a group of, 5 white men, heterosexual men, who had to brainstorm doing the marketing campaign of a product, and then they had a full group of colorful group, like United Colors of Benetton, gays and lesbians and people with disability and people from marginalized communities. And they noticed that people, the groups, plural groups, heterogeneous groups, were much more creative, and that somehow the ideas that came from homogeneous groups were quite tame. So that's when the whole, hype over diversity started. Then, of course, the idea moved from the corporate world to the non-governmental sector, to contexts which were aspiring towards social justice. And there the focus was on multiplicity and plurality of social categorizations, and how also there was a multiplicity, I mean, there was an attention to the multiplicity of origins of power, and how power operated very dynamically in social and political arenas. So diversity politics involved an agenda of action for promulgating political and social policies. And very quickly, it got linked to anti discrimination politics and also promoting equal opportunities for previously marginalized individuals and groups. So it was a very important cornerstone in advocating justice, democracy, and institutions, but beyond that, also uh, society at large. Now, there have been certain controversies around diversity. That diversity tends to, be this very happy notion of, oh, we are all equal and we're different but same. And there's been, but I'll come back to it towards the end. Um, I find it, when we're talking about multiplicity of issues and multi-issue feminism, the next slide, I think, wonderfully captures the sentiment of non-white, non-Western feminism, which, with a quote of Audre Lorde, who says, there is no such thing as single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. So let's take the ongoing pandemic. When we're talking about, homeschooling, when we're talking about the economic repercussions. I was just reading the other day that in the US, 140 jobs have been lost, and the majority of them are women, female workers. So here we are seeing how gender, and a lot of them are women of color. So here we see already how gender, race, class comes together to produce particular registers of both agency and vulnerability. And I think if we could move to the next slide, this has been a very, very important contribution of intersectionality, which was historically rooted in the experiences of oppression of Black women. So, as we know, in 1851, Sojourner Truth gave this very famous talk, Anti Woman, which exemplified how she spoke from a racialized position as a former slave, which challenged essentialist notions of femininity. And Crenshaw, who's uh, um, uh, who's coined the term intersectionality, understands it in terms of the link between racial and gender injustice. If we could move on to the next slide. So, as I was saying, the beauty of intersectionality as a concept, as an approach, as a methodology, as an intervention in mainstream, both um, um, feminist scholarship, but also scholarship on anti-racism, scholarship on anti-imperialism, has been that it focuses on the co-constitutiveness of class, race, gender, just to name a few categories, and simultaneously tries to think together agency and vulnerability. This is the beauty of intersectionality. It's not just the focus, it's not just simply focus on victimhood and vulnerability, but also on agency, on privileges, which is why Patricia Hill Collins speaks about matrix of domination. She's talking simultaneously, which is why I like the concept of multidirectional critique of both oppression and privilege. So, how whiteness, how being bourgeois produces, this is also intersectionality. When we focus on masculinity, on whiteness, on class, this is an intersectional perspective on privileges, on entitlement. And when we focus on blackness, on economic disadvantages, on say for example being a trans person, we're focusing on how particular registers of vulnerability are produced structurally. And as we know, Crenshaw, as a legal scholar, explains intersectionality through this very famous example of the court case against General Motors, where it was argued that where black women were fired from their jobs, and Motors defended himself and said, you can't accuse of racism because we have black men working for us, and you can't accuse us of sexism because we have white women working for us. And this is what Crenshaw shows, that when we only think in terms of separate categories, then those who are, and this is Crenshaw's metaphor of, I mean, the historically the black feminists talk about double jeopardy, and Crenshaw uses the metaphor of multiple collisions. If you're hit by one car, which is racism, then you are vulnerable at one level. But if you're hit by racism, sexism, classism, multiple forms of discriminations come together to produce particular forms of inequality on a micro level, namely in the family, but also on the macro level, within communities, within organizations, within at the straight structure. So we have to simultaneously think of co-constitutiveness of different categories on a macro level. So what intersectionality, like diversity, tries to do is repeal discriminatory provisions in policy, while at the same time enacting new policies to enshrine and provisions to enshrine gender, racial, and sexual equality. So another very important point, if we could move to the next slide, is that there is that intersectionality or diversity, for that matter, is not just a mathematization of discrimination. So it's not an Olympics of oppression, as Crenshaw points out. It's not just, if you're only facing discrimination on the basis of racism, then you're, discriminated once. And then if it's also sexism that comes together, then it's double. And if classicism comes in, that it's three times. And rather, it's a much more complex analysis of how different categories come together. So one of my favorite examples is somebody like uh, Oprah Winfrey, who's one of the richest black women in the world. And Winfrey was in Switzerland for an event, and was just taking a walk around, the shopping district in Switzerland, in Zurich, and entered this very fancy leather boutique and asked the woman, she just saw a handbag, and pointed out and said, can I have a look at it? And the woman turned to her, the shopkeeper turned to her and said, you can't afford it. So here we have the case of somebody who's, the richest black woman in the world, who's also not immune from racism. And then, of course, I give my own example. I have a third world passport. I am, I'm a woman of color from the global south, but I live in the global north. I have a permanent job. I have papers. So my vulnerability is offset by the privileges, by the agency I've accumulated. So we always need to bear in mind both aspects when we are focusing on diversity, intersectionality, and social justice. I've already, if we could move to the next slide, I've already mentioned Crenshaw's metaphor of the traffic intersection of multiple car collisions, where different categories come together, and how vulnerability is a much more complex phenomena than just mathematization of different forms of discrimination. So the next slide, to answer the opening question, what differences make? Both Crenshaw and Angela Davis argue that differences make a difference, and differences should be allowed to make a difference. That when we are talking about justice, when we are using universal categories like diversity, intersectionality, I mean, intersectionality and diversity have done incredible careers. I mean, they've made it all the way to UN, and they've been, completely co-opted by the NGO machinery. And having said that, we have to be very, very cognizant of how differences don't get weaponized and co-opted by capitalism, patriarchal structures, where in the name of doing justice, in the name of diversity politics, I move on to my next slide, and the last 6 minutes that I have, I'd like to focus on what Sarah Ahmed calls non-performativity of diversity and intersectionality. So what Sarah Ahmed suggests is that despite the hype surrounding diversity as an and both and I've added intersectionality to my in the analysis, despite it being celebrated as as emancipatory concepts, sometimes regrettably they remain as mere lip service. And Sarah Ahmed did this very interesting study where she identified that the more institutions spoke about their commitment to diversity and equality programs, the less diverse they were. So there was a discontinuity between rhetoric and reality. And interestingly, if we could move to the next slide, she said that the utterance that we are diversity friendly, all these I mean the university I work at, and I'm sure Brunel also talks about being equal opportunity employers, about how they want to support women to reconcile work life balance, and she says that what is interesting is that the failure of living up to their commitment to diversity is not actually it's not a breakdown in the politics, but actually the success lies in not doing what it claims. So there is a pledge made to be diversity friendly, and in not being diversity friendly, actually they are successful. So it's not that the discourses and guidelines surrounding diversity are completely ineffective, but rather they don't necessarily lead to the effects that they promise. There is a gap between what is promised and what is delivered. And because they have all these, all our universities have these seals of, in international rankings, they all have these seals of approval saying they're diversity friendly. You can't accuse them of racism and sexism because they can prove their credentials by saying, of course, we are diversity friendly. So my university and my institute and my department can say, how can you say we're not diversity friendly? Because we have somebody like you who's the head of the institute, and we have a woman of color. And this is what Sarah Ahmed points out, that we have to be very cautious about how diversity and intersectionality are in a certain way weaponized, if we can move on to the next slide, through institutional self-representation as being anti-racist and anti-sexist. So we have to be very cognizant of the non-performative rhetoric that prevents combating that which it pretends to abolish. Now, Ahmed is not only negative about diversity and intersectionality, because she does point out that these can work as, if we could move to the previous slide, that they can work to empower marginalized and discriminated individuals and groups to make claims towards social justice. So it's not that they're completely, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And what she is pointing out is that somehow we need to hold these institutions responsible and accountable towards their commitment. So my last sentence, and I think I'm almost within my time limit, is that I would say that diversity, intersectionality, and norms of social justice are like pharmacon. They are like, both, this is a Derridian concept, that they are both poison and counter poison medicine. So as Ahmed and also other scholars have pointed out, that diversity politics, intersectionality politics, social justice, rhetorics and discourses, narratives can be used by institutions, can be used by organizations, um, not to deliver what they promise, but they can also, so this is where it becomes poison, because then they merely become lip service. They merely become, a kind of I'm now getting the German word, distraction. At the same time, they can also serve as tools in the hands of, and I've said this before, I'm repeating myself, in the hands of socially marginalized groups to make claims against discrimination. So a lot of my colleagues who do radical politics say that, we don't want to use concepts like diversity, we don't want to use concepts like social justice, because they're so contaminated. They are so flawed. They're so Eurocentric and androcentric. So whenever you think about justice, you immediately think about a liberal universalist scholar like Martha Nussbaum. Whenever you think about diversity, you think about the capitalist corporate world. So they would argue, drawing on Audre Lorde, that you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. I would argue, in contrast, that perhaps there is hope, perhaps there is the possibility of using these contaminated tools, using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. Thank you so much for your attention, and I really look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nikita. That was very interesting, very intellectually stimulating, and some of the issues that you've raised resonate with issues that are going to be raised in the other three presentations. I can see some questions in the chat, but as I said at the beginning, we're going to take questions later. I understand there's a few people who have just joined us. Just to repeat again, that the sessions are being recorded. So I suggest we move on so that we have enough time for questions towards the end. And towards the end of the session, I'd like to spend just a few minutes letting you know about future events of the Interculturality for Diversity and Global Learning Research Group, and also about membership and some of the activities that we have planned for the future. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Juliana Ferry, who's been with us at Brunel for a year. I think, Juliana, we've both joined around the same time, didn't we?
We did, yes.
Yes. Okay. So are you happy to introduce yourself, or shall I read? Would you prefer me to read your bio? I'm happy to do that.
Yes, Maria. Yes, thank you. So prepare the screen. Yes.
Yeah, just a minute. I'll just stop my read, and then I'll. Okay, just a minute. Right. Juliana Ferry, she's going to talk about Beyond Otherness, a post-human framework for intercultural communication. And this paper problematizes essentialist notions of culture and identity and instrumental notions of intercultural competence. Juliana Ferry is a senior lecturer in education at Brunel University. Before completing her PhD, Juliana taught for over 10 years in multicultural and multilingual primary schools in London, where she developed an interest in interculturalism, applied linguistics, and critical pedagogies. Juliana's research and publication cover a range of topics relating to language ideology, education policy, and interculturality. And her monogram, Intercultural Communication, Critical Approaches and Future Challenges, was published in 2018 by Parker Macmillan. So without further ado, over to you, Juliana.
Thank you, Maria. So I've actually slightly changed the title. It's Beyond Otherness, a Critical Perspective in Intercultural Communication, but the substance has not changed. Thank you, Maria, for introducing me. So my talk will be shorter than Nikita's, and what I'll try to do today really is to provide an overview of the field of intercultural communication for those who are not familiar, because we have quite a diverse audience today. And the main aim really is to problematize what I see as an implicit cultural hierarchy within the field of interculturality. And also to formulate a few questions around the need to look at theoretically informed methodologies to research interculturality beyond the idea of otherness. So I will critique this idea of the other and the binary between the self and the other. So just a quick overview now of the field of intercultural communication for those who may not be familiar. As I said, we have a diverse audience. So this field of research of intercultural communication started with Anglo-American hegemony after World War II, with the need to maintain relations with countries that were strategically important economically and politically. And the aim of intercultural communication at that point was to categorize cultural behaviors according to a general distinction between Western, in particular Anglo-American, and non-Western cultural traditions. And so this created a boundary, this boundary between us and them, so the Western self and the non-Western other. And so there is, for example, the idea that Western cultures are more individualistic and value freedom, and then people from non-Western cultures are more formal and display more respect for authorities. And there is this stereotype around cultural diversity. And so what the aim of intercultural communication from this essentialist perspective was to teach the skills and competencies to learn how to behave in a culturally appropriate manner with the other. So in order to avoid misunderstandings and conflict. And so for this reason, intercultural communication has historically been researched in the context of business and diplomatic relations. And more recently in higher education, with the drive to recruit international students in the context of the increased marketization of the sector. And so this has fueled what has been defined as an intercultural industry, providing training, intercultural training in successful interaction within multicultural workplaces and increasingly in education settings, particularly in higher education. But also there is a more recent development in the field of critical intercultural communication. And what this critical approach does is to problematize the reliance on the binary division between a Western self and a non-Western other that has historically underpinned the field of intercultural communication. And so some of this critical work within interculturality emphasizes the value of critical pedagogy applied to language teaching and also challenges cultural essentialism with a more fluid understanding of culture and identity in order to capture the complexities of intercultural interactions in education settings and also in the workplace. So this critical interculturalism is applied to language teaching, to progressive and critical pedagogical projects, for example, in projects of cooperation with refugees and minority groups within institutions such as the European Union. And so these are important values, a critical appreciation of culture, the questioning of assumptions of inferiority of the non-Western others, engagement in dialogue, the notion of intercultural responsibility when dealing with others. And I think these are important values that foster understanding, cooperation and dialogue, particularly in the current context. But I think it is also important to problematize some of the assumptions that are made within narratives of emancipation, awareness, responsibility. And in particular, I think it is important to problematize and to critically examine how these narratives are based on an idea of otherness that can be ascribed to a vision of Western cultural hegemony. And in particular, this idea around giving voice to the other, this idea of allowing the other to speak. And so here I find that the notion of epistemic violence is very helpful in trying to unpack this notion of otherness that underpins the field of intercultural communication. And this is from epistemic violence is from the work of a very important post-colonial feminist theorist, Gayatri Spivak, and she defines Western cultural dominance through this notion of epistemic violence, and referring to the practice of creating an inferior other, particularly in the context of colonial domination. And Spivak uses the term subaltern from Gramsci's use of the word. And I think, you know, this notion of epistemic violence is important within the field of interculturality, because it allows to ask a fundamental question: who speaks for the other? Who gives voice to the other? And it allows us to interrogate knowledge production within the field of interculturality, because it allows us to interrogate the type of knowledge that is produced, interrogating this binary between the self and the other, and started to problematize the narratives around the concept of awareness, cultural awareness, competence, and responsibility. And my main argument really is that the idea of otherness is underpinned by inequality, for example, linguistic inequality, or discourses of nativeness that place some people as more deserving than others on the basis of nationality, of citizenship, or race and ethnicity. And also by global inequalities within neoliberal economies. I'm just switching on to the next slide. So I think, you know, that there are two main methodological implications here. I'm coming back to this, to the need to look at methodology and theoretically informed methodological approaches to engage with the notion of interculturality. So I think that it is important to look at intercultural interaction as a complex and embodied experience that is located not only in language and in interpersonal communication, but also in our relations with cultural artifacts, in our relation with the environment that surrounds us, and also in personal narratives. Coming back to Nikita's notion of agency, it is important to, I think, to emphasize agency within interculturality. But also, I think it is important to look at including within research and interculturality not only the attempt to avoid misunderstandings and conflict, but it's important to include narratives of disruption, miscommunication, power imbalance, and injustice when narrating and researching the intercultural, which also implies reviewing our own complicity with power and hegemonic practices as researchers. So I think that one of the major methodological implications that opens up when we consider these questions around otherness and giving voice to the other is switching from the idea of the other as a monolithic entity that represents a cultural tradition and start to think beyond the other. And I would say to leave the idea of the other behind, the idea of otherness behind, and to embrace the notion of subjectivity and how subjectivity is composed of multiple and intersecting subject positions. So the idea of intersectionality, how gender, sexuality, religion, race, ethnicity, abilities, language, how these different subject positions interact with each other. And in line with post-humanist philosophers, such, for example, Donna Haraway and Rosie Bradotti, they have presented this notion of subjectivity and multiple and intersecting subject positions, also embracing the non-human, including our relation with nature and with the technological world. And I think it is particularly important to highlight these two dimensions that are becoming increasingly relevant. One is technology and its influence on communication, and the other is the natural world, in particular how environmental concerns can impact on growing global inequality and forced migration, which in turn reinforce cultural hierarchies and the binary self-other mentioned at the beginning. And I think this also opens up the field to further avenues in terms of interdisciplinary research in relation to digital technologies and environmental concerns. I'm just concluding now. My main argument was to challenge the binaries of other and the idea of otherness that underpins the notion of interculturality, of intercultural communication, but also the idea of intercultural competence as a process, a linear process of acquisition of skills, from a perspective that questions the power imbalance inherent in the idea of self and other. And so I invite a shift from an understanding of communication between the self and the other that can be analyzed according to cultural parameters, to rethinking the intercultural in terms of shifting and multiple subjectivities that engage actively with the world, both human and non-human, through which they construct meaning and find purpose. And I think that capturing this dynamic represents one of the avenues for critical interculturality. So thank you, that's all for me. I think I'm within the time, 15 minutes.
Yeah, no, that's fine, that's fine.
Thank you, Maria.
That was great, thank you very much. And
thank you.
Two presentations will follow nicely from your ideas around otherness. As I said earlier, we'll take questions at the end. I'd like to introduce now Gunjan Vadva, who joined us recently from India as an ESRC postdoctoral fellow, working with me as her mentor. We're delighted to have her at the Department of Education at Brunel. So again, if you just bear with me while I find my notes about Gunjan's bio. Right, so Gunjan is going to talk about negotiating difference, contesting temporalities, education as a site for us, struggle in Adivasi identities in India. So she's going to highlight the dominance of colonial temporal discourses of development in the productions of indigenous Adivasi identities through education in a local village community in India. Gunjan is an incoming ESRC research fellow at the Department of Education. She completed her PhD at the Center for International Education, University of Sussex, on Adivasi identities in an area of civil unrest in India. Her research troubles the dominant discursive strains that produce the post-colonial nation, state, and citizen, and through this position, marginalized groups like the Adivasis in opposition to ideas of the modern. In engaging with national policy and local communities, her work encourages a critical approach to social categories and difference in the global South. Right.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you for those brilliant presentations, Nikita and Juliana. So what I will do is I will touch upon the things that have been said by the two previous presenters, and also now specifically talk about my doctoral research. So I will draw on empirical work that I did in my doctoral study with the Adivasi community in India. And this research was at the Center for International Education at University of Sussex. So what I will talk about is education as a site of struggle in the negotiation and navigation of the indigenous Adivasi identities in India. So I'll briefly give the context, the research context. So India is an emergent post-colonial context with struggles for independence from the colonial rule or the British Raj, and became a nation out of partition in India as two separate nations. And there's histories of internal conflict and resistance movements to date against the Indian state. So last year we saw massive protests against the state's citizenship law in India. And today, as India celebrates its Republic Day, we're seeing about 1 million farmers protesting in the country against the state's agricultural laws. One of the highest youth populations in the world in India, and also a resurgence of nationalism or Hindu nationalism in electoral politics in the country. And it's important to note that India ranks slowly on the international development indices and the gender equality indices. So about this particular research, it took place through an ethnographic case study design in a village in the Vidarbh region of Maharashtra, which borders the Bastar region in Chhattisgarh, which is considered the hotbed of the Maoist movement in the country. So there's a context of violence, there's a context of insurgency and civil unrest. And I spent about 7 months doing ethnographic data collection with the indigenous Adivasi community and the non-Adivasi OBC community and other groups in the country. And this study used alternative frameworks, so to speak. So I used post-structural theorizations of concepts used in the analysis of data, along with post-colonial and feminist literature. Now, in this presentation, I will foreground community voices to highlight the navigation of identities. But before that, just to give another context of how the national policy and how the legal framework defines and names the Adivasis in India, or the scheduled tribes in India. So this is how the policy framework defines the Adivasis in India, which is low levels of pre-agricultural level of technology, economic backwardness, low level of literacy, one of the most vulnerable sections of society, have not attained economic development, require protection, indications of primitive traits, distinctive culture, geographical isolation, shyness of contact, and general backwardness. So this act of naming and this power to classify and categorize in context of the Adivasis in India, it provides us a glimpse of the temporally framed discourses of development and almost nod to the criteria of the colonial regime, of the colonial state in the country. So the signifiers of declining population, stagnant population, low levels of literacy, backwardness, vulnerability, and so the need for protection of the particular group. And it's illustrative of what post-colonial theorists like Mamdani and Assad and Mahmood have referred to as the language of law of the modern nation states. Mamdani says that if the law recognizes you as a member of an ethnicity and the state institutions treat you as such, then you become an ethnic being legally. And Assad saying that minorities, and in this case, ethnic minorities, are no different from majorities, also a historically constituted group, because minorities are defined as minorities only in hierarchical structures of power. So again, criteria such as pre-agricultural technology, they presuppose a linear progression of forward movement central to the modernization and development discourses framed by the colonial discourses of development. And this dominant national and international discourse permeates and pervades the local community levels. And education here is significant in this naming, and it linked to what the research participants had to say in the context. So I had 2 participants, Nand and Rajesh, who spoke to me in official capacities. And they said, the parents here have only ever gone to the forest. They've never been to school themselves. That is the main problem in our villages. The people here belong to another time and age. They are pichre, purane, they're older, different people. They're slowly changing. And Rajesh saying, people here do not understand at once. It takes a while. They're another generation. You should not expect them to respond. They're like that only. It will take time for things to change. So this description of the community as going to forest, which was placed in opposition to going to school, it signaled this way of life, forestry work, as deficit, as the only work that people knew in this context. And the reference to time and age. So the Adivasis, the indigenous community, they were assumed to be static or to be slowly changing and primitive and underdeveloped. But it's important to note that these labels were associated with the parents, the Adivasi parents, whereas the youth were assumed to be different. The youth were assumed to be changing and going to school and agents of change. So the emphasis on time and oldness of people to denote difference, to distinguish them from others in the village. And again, it linked to what Massey has said in Space, Place, and Gender, that mobility and control over mobility both reflects and reinforces power. And mobility and control of some groups can actively weaken other groups. Differential mobility can weaken the leverage of the already weak. Now, this deficit discourse was embodied by the youth as well in the local village community. So they were interpolated into this deficit social positioning. And Abhay and Nam here with the young Adivasi youth saying that this is a backward area because it is tribal. It has a tribal population, so it is backward and illiterate. Anyone can make fools of us. And now I'm saying that I'm trying to improve myself as much as I can. We are backward because we get distracted. We fall in love, we consume alcohol, we chew tobacco. I'm trying not to do these things. If Ambedkar could work 18 hours, why can't we? I don't want 2 months of holidays as I will lose touch with my studies. I've started fasting once a week so I can focus more. So both Nam and Abhi, they drew on the dominant discourses to describe the young people in the village as backward. And Nam here specifically used issues of alcohol and tobacco to mark the Adivasis as distracted and his concerns about falling in love. Now, in a different context, falling in love, drinking, smoking could be assumed as cool or progressive or modern. But in this context, all of these things consolidated the construction of the Adivasi as backward. Education here provided a way out of this deficit. So the identification of Nam with Ambedkar, who was a Dalit and who was also a member of the Constituent Assembly, who was chairman of the drafting committee of the Constitution. So it reflected their association of good education with progress and change. And again, this linked to Stuart Hall's claim here that these discursive processes of identity construction produce points of temporary attachment to these subject positions, and that both the dominant and the dominated are complicit in the reproduction of power relations, if not on equal terms. But this discursive processes, this discursive othering and marginalization of the Adivasis had very strong gendered implications in the local context. So with young women saying things like that, we had to leave education. It was an early morning school when most of the work needed to be done. How could I have gone to school? We were 2 sisters and 3 brothers. The brothers studied till class 10, but all of us had to drop out. And Sag saying that my elder sister dropped out after class 5. And some years later, my brother and I dropped out too. But now we are able to rejoin school, but my sister got married and could not finish her school. So for the Adivasi women in the village, the work done by them within and outside the home conflicted with ideas of formal education, with the modernist notion of going to school, which was temporally framed. So in the Indian context, the Right to Education Act is temporally implemented. So every child has to be in an age-appropriate class, which disregarded the everyday routines and the specificities of the local context. But they made this inconsistency between work and school known and explicit, and they made these very strong and eloquent demands for inclusion. And in doing so, they fragmented the existing discourse by foregrounding their context. So again, this is what some other the research participants said, things like that I want to be in section A with science and not in arts or in social sciences because there are not many jobs after doing arts. But even if I do arts or social sciences, I feel like I can do anything when I study. And they're saying that I want to continue working and studying, become something, take care of my parents and then get married. Girls here, we want to study, but we also want English education. Our parents might be a different and older generation, but they give us the strength to work and study. So these comments again illustrate the inadequacy of the development, the modernizing discourses in this context, and more broadly, the assumptions that frame the subject as stable, rational, unified, what the previous presenters have also touched on. Rather, they acknowledge the coexistence of multiple subjectivities and trouble the binaries that haunt the modernizing and development discourses, while pointing to the interpellation of the Adivasis within the dominant and a reciting of their deficit positioning. There is also a fragmentation of this discourse. So while the young people embody this discourse, they subvert and contest it through the association of things like the strength with their parents. Similarly, the demands for science and English are both a form of subjectivation and agency, resistance and resignification in this context. So by foregrounding their specific context, the community reappropriated the established discourse selectively to resist their marginalization and othering, and navigate their identity strategically. Again, beautifully connecting to what Judith Butler has said about that, while these norms structure our responses, our modes of embodiment can be ways of contesting those norms, even breaking with those norms. So I think finally, to conclude, and the implications for, for the intercultural, for intersectional, the research that we're all focusing on and talking about here, that these temporalized understandings of development in policy risk inscribing binaries, specifically the tradition modernity binaries in global South context, and they worsen the already deficit positioning of historically marginalized and subordinated groups like the Adivasis, rendering Adivasi women doubly disadvantaged due to their ethnic and gender positionings, and negatively impacting their struggles and demands for social justice, equity, and inclusion. So the contingencies of context are significant to understand these complex assertions of power and identity. And so facilitating social justice then involves paying attention to these local contexts and the gendered intersections of nation, religion, caste, ethnicity, tribe, location. And I'll end with a quote from Bhabha, who says that the other is never outside or beyond us. It emerges forcefully when we think we speak most intimately and indigenously between ourselves. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Gunjan. Very nice quote. Yeah, it's one of my favorites. Thank you. Well, between ourselves and within ourselves. Anyway, we're going to continue with, exploring deficit of others and otherness. Dori and myself are going to give the next presentation. Please keep the questions coming, put them in the chat, and we'll look at them later. So again, if you bear with me while I...
Would you like me to share the presentation, Maria?
I'll try, and if I have any problem,
okay.
I'll let you
sure.
know. I have to say I'm very unlucky when it comes to technology. I mean, when I'm on my own, everything seems to go fine. When there's loads of people, something always goes wrong. So, okay. The title of the presentation that will be delivered jointly by myself and Dr. Dori Redai, The Object Others, The Object Others, Intercultural Research on Gender as a Site of Resistance Against White Hegemony, Anglocentrism and Neocolonization. Just a little bit about myself and Dori. I joined Brunel in 2019 as a professor of education, having worked in education, health and medicine for 20 years. My work is international and cross-disciplinary and explores the interfaces of gender, educational policy discourses and professional identities in neoliberal contexts. However, my research interests are very broad, and in the last 20 years, I have explored issues around gender-based violence, academic motherhood, feminist sisterhood, the reproduction of intersectional inequalities in higher education, women's health, and medical careers. The book that we've published, or was about to publish in January, February 2019, is Gender Stereotyping in Secondary Schools, Case Studies from the UK, Hungary, and Italy. That's a joint publication with Dori. Dori is an independent scholar working in the field of gender, sexuality and education in Hungary. She has a PhD in gender studies from Central European University, and her research interests include the reproduction of intersectional inequalities in compulsory education, sex education, and gender in education policies in Central Eastern Europe. Besides her research and training work, she's also an activist in LGBT and women's non-governmental organizations, and her monograph Exploring Sexuality in Schools, the Intersectional Reproduction of Inequality, was published in 2019 by Palgrave Macmillan. So I'll try to share the presentation now. I'm just trying to get this. Okay, that's fine. So, yeah, so the title of the presentation, The Object Others, Intercultural Research on Gender as a Site of Resistance Against White Hegemony, Anglocentrism, and Neo-colonization. So we're talking, I mean, our focus is on a slightly different issue, but we come to it from basically, you know, we'll share some of the ideas mentioned in or discussed in earlier presentations. So Dori and I have a lot of experience of working on European funded, EU-funded research projects about gender and social justice. And it's interesting though that whenever European-funded research is discussed, it's usually surrounded by a discourse of, by a celebratory discourse and a discourse of glamour, very similar really to discourses of internationalization in higher education and discourses of mobility. However, EU-funded research and the participation of researchers from different countries and different ethnicities in multidisciplinary and multinational research teams comes with a lot of challenges, really. So, and also might actually create new inequalities, exacerbate old ones, or form new forms of colonization. So we feel that in order to think critically about EU-funded research, we need to think critically about feminist epistemology and gender scholarship hierarchies, particularly for those of us who work within the field of gender, women's studies, and gender in education. Think critically about global South inequalities, but also East, West, North, South inequalities within the European context. Think critically about academic self-colonization, issues around emotional labor, and we're going to finish the presentation with interbeing as a way forward. So really, two questions that we have been concerned with since we first met, Dori and myself, and we've had numerous conversations about this, and we're hoping that this presentation will be developed into a paper for a special issue, and I'm going to talk to you more about our special issue later on today. So how EU research and research synergies can create new forms of colonization and stabilize gender and racial relations of domination, and how feminist politics can get entangled with neo-colonial and neo-imperialist politics and trace these connections in the European context. So I think before we start thinking critically about these issues, I think it's important to think a little bit about the context of EU-funded research on gender and social justice. So again, you know, drawing on our experience and our knowledge and expert knowledge in the field. I mean, gender is an idea, a concept, a category of analysis that is thought, understood, and performed very differently across different European countries, and also the gender studies field as a field of knowledge in Europe occupies different positions and enjoys different status across different countries in Europe. And Dori is going to talk more about her experience as a Hungarian gender scholar. However, the language that has been used in EU-funded projects has been English, and I don't know why or when that decision was made, really. I mean, most European colleagues speak a number of other languages, so I'm not sure if the argument that English is widely spoken it really counts here. But we have used this language for communication, for research. Within the gender studies field, we use also, the Anglophone literature, because really this is what really exists. There is very little from other countries in Europe. I think what we need is a critical focus on Anglocentric or Eurocentric knowledge and truth claims, and also a critical focus on Europe as a complex set of geopolitical, historical, and epistemological processes, and not just as a neutral site. So, I mean, there's loads of questions that I have been thinking about and discussing with various people, also about around, for example, what is Europe and what is perceived as Europe? Because usually when people talk about Europe, I mean, they only refer to Western Europe without Western Europe, the UK, Scandinavian countries, or Germany, without acknowledging, contributions in the field from Central European countries or Mediterranean countries. So there's huge inequalities, but very interesting perceptions of different perceptions of different countries within Europe, countries from the north, the south, the east, and the west. And are also certainly differences in terms of material or access to well, there's definitely a number of inequalities, material inequalities, but also symbolic inequalities. And then another issue that also gets, I think, a limited attention in EU-funded research is the international politics within and beyond research teams. We come, just to say briefly here, that we come to this research, from as researchers who occupy various positions, as having, a particular nationality, particular color. I mean, some of us, and this is not a categorization that I'm comfortable with, this notion of white or being white, because it's an identity that was never prevalent to me until I came to the UK when I was in my 20s. But when we participate in these research teams, even if we're seen as white, and here to draw on Bopel's work, a phrase that she uses very often in her work about different shades of whiteness, as white Europeans, we occupy a less privileged position compared to white English. I also want to talk briefly about paternalistic care, because what came through the data and also the research process and our relationships was dominant discourses of pathology and rescue. Discourse of pathology and rescue of the Muslim girl, but also of the second-class European girl, woman, and researchers. And what was evident really in the research process was the performances of white Anglo supremacy and hegemonic gender performances, which interesting, I mean, those performances actually took place in very interesting sites and moments, but also when the evidence suggested, for example, that, in one particular project that we were involved with, Dori, I mean, there were no big differences really in terms of gender inequality across the countries who participated. So there wasn't one country who kind of exceeded in terms of gender inequality, who was a great example that other countries could follow. And yet again, on a number of occasions, I mean, what was expressed from UK researchers was that the UK was well ahead, and that was far from the truth, again based on what the data showed us. So in my view, I think there was a degree of intercultural blindness. And personally, I mean, we both Dora and myself, engaged in huge emotional labor in an attempt to manage hearts and bodies, as I would say. And myself felt very much as an in-betweener, managing, my migrant academic identity, my dual citizenship, and I felt that, the burden of resilience was too much at times. I also felt very often being in the zone of non-being, as Fanon claims, so being more the object rather than the subject of the political and epistemological order. And again, being the European white other, as I mentioned earlier. Dori, I mean, do you want to talk now about colonized cells?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, I would like to start by saying, because these are all thoughts that we are talking about, so we hope that we can develop them into some more organized forms. But these are things that regularly come up, as Maria said. We have both worked in European projects for a long time, and so kind of academic colonization is one of the things that that I have kept thinking about through all these years of working in European projects. And because of my education, because I was, can we go to the next slide, please?
Yes.
Maybe, yeah, that's not the one actually, but let me just stop here for a second. It was very interesting to discuss with Maria how differently we were positioned in our environment as researchers. As she mentioned, she was working as an academic migrant in an English environment, whereas I was working in a home context, but at the same time in a terribly hostile environment as far as reception of ideas about gender and gender equality is concerned. So it was very hard to get to schools to research gender equality and so on. I won't go into details because we have a short time, but that was a very different position. And also our position was different in how this was a project where we had academic and NGO partners, which was very beneficial in many respects. But also here questions of hierarchy and workload came up all the time, like who owns what expertise, who should rely on the other for knowledge. In my case, for example, the NGO we worked with hadn't worked with gender issues before. They have been working in global education, but not specifically gender. So I was the expertise for everything and had to do everything. So it had consequences for the workload, and they were kind of getting educated in the process. Whereas in Maria's context, it was very different with the NGOs that had been working in the field for ages, and these issues of expertise and hierarchy were very different, actually. The other issue was the language that had to be used to explain gender in the field, in the research field, and then I do find myself all the time translating back and forth, like to the, for example, to the English partners. We also had Italian partners in this project, so it was Italy, Hungary, and the UK participating. And I think we all found ourselves constantly translating back and forth, like, what do you mean by gender? What our respondents mean by gender? And then translating myself as well, not only the research findings. So in all these European projects, it's a very, so for all the partners who are not, who don't have English as a mother tongue, they don't come from an English or British culture, and as the language is English in the project, you constantly have to translate your ideas, your experiences, your positionality, your you know, back and forth between your own language, the English context, and then when there are different partners, if there are many partners in a project, many European partners, then, you know, between one another, like who means what. So it's very challenging work, very productive as well, you know, finding out about what, who means what by which term. And can we go to the next?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I should have put that
Yes. So
first. Sorry.
I come back to academic colonization and self-colonization, which I have been wondering about, and I haven't really kind of got to a point where I could position myself theoretically in this respect, but my education is in English. I studied English as for my first master. I have always worked in English, both in my academic and my other work life. I rely on gender studies scholarship in English because gender studies, and especially in education, there's very little scholarship in Hungarian. And and not only gender and education scholarship, but the there's a lack for language, lack of language for gender studies and for gender notions and gender inequality in Hungary. It's a very serious linguistic issue, but also, of course, a social issue, and and so these lacks, you know, and then on top of all that, you lack usually kind of academic position in gender studies which you can live on, you know, you can make a living from. So you have to, because Hungarian academic positions and salaries and the situation of researchers is just dramatically poor. So you have to rely on EU funded research projects so that you can do something, you know, academically and earn some money, of course. So it's very hard. You have to keep establishing your own academic grants all the time. And on top of all this, there is a lack of reflection in EU funding on colonization. So all this puts us in a very complex position of like, where do I speak from? What I rely on? Of course, I'm very happy to rely on, you know, on any available scholarship, including Anglophone scholarship. But at the same time, it's a very difficult position to be in. And just to mention a new issue that will further problematize this area. At the moment, I'm working in again an EU-funded collaborative project between about 10 European partners, and we are working to get universities to design their gender equality plan, because for the new Horizon projects, this will be mandatory that the applicant universities have their gender equality plans. Now this will, it's foreseeable that and I'm in charge of trying to get Central Eastern European universities to learn about how to introduce gender equality plans. So, so another inequality is emerging on the way to the EU trying to access gender equality. There will be probably a larger inequality in the process because of not being able to apply for funds for universities who don't have gender equality plans. So I think it's a very interesting thing to think about forward, but it was just an aside. Let's move on, please. Because we would also like to talk about the way forward, like how we can think about all these issues and how we can position ourselves
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, just a bit.
Sorry.
Mariana and I, in our numerous conversations, we have arrived at thinking that now you have to think about these questions. Now, how does one survive in the hierarchical world of EU research? So whenever you join a research or you design a research, this is a very important question to tackle both during the application process and in the process when you are working together with different teams from different countries. How does one navigate categories and normative ideas that are no longer or that have never been helpful? Just an example from the project that we worked together with Maria in. We designed a gender equality charter mark for schools, which was led by an English partner, and then the Hungarian team and the Italian team adopted the charter marks to their own national context because the English didn't always make sense or was not realistic, you know. And anyway, why would we follow that example? And that's where we started to think about, like, because it emerged, you know, how even the very concept of gender was so differently interpreted in just these three national contexts. And then currently the project is continued in another project where there are 9 countries adopting the gender equality charter marks. And I think a very good practice emerged that has really questioned normative ideas of what such a charter mark, such a, you know, a set of measurements should look like, because all the countries have adopted their charter marks in very different ways. If you compare them, you know, perhaps the basic ideas are similar, but all became meaningful in their own context, much more meaningful than following a one single charter mark. So so this is the kind of navigation that's very important to do in such a context, and then crossing borders and moving beyond binaries. Of course, that's evidently a very important issue, and and also in terms of research methodology, we have to think about how to decolonize methodologies, but both for research and for promoting interculturality in social justice research. Let's move to the last slide.
Yeah, just to say one more thing about just to add on survival in the hierarchical world of EU research, and just to bring it back to emotional labor, because I mean, surviving is not something that should be taken lightly. And again, drawing on our own experience, I mean, personally, I would say that some of that experience was very, very traumatic. And although it might help, talking about it or writing about it actually might be cathartic, the fact doesn't change. There are entrenched inequalities in EU-funded research and multidisciplinary and multinational teams. So we do need to think about how we decolonize methodologies for promoting interculturality and social justice. And just thinking of the way forward, we draw here on the transformative pedagogy of interbeing by Asher. And we propose that it's important to move the focus from the marginalized other to the examination of the self at the center of the dominant culture. I think sometimes in intercultural research, and particularly in feminist and gender research, we tend to forget about ourselves, I mean the self and other, but in a relational form. And we tend to forget that we need to critique our own practices first before we start thinking about other inequalities. I think it's important to learn from each other rather than have one country as a model or the norm that other countries should follow. And in order to do that, I think it would be helpful to draw on post-colonial and transnational feminist approaches to deconstruct essentialist representations and interrogate how colonization or neo-colonization, actually, Europeization and Anglocentrism might shape academic identity and culture. and forge discourses about difference that are more attuned to the complexities of European research. So some references here. Yes. So, thank you all very much. So I think we can start taking questions now. There's already a few in the chat box, so I'm going to read them in the right order. Right, let me just, okay. So, Chrissy, is that correct? Chrissy or Chrissy da Costa? In the Indian context or South Asian context, what about caste discrimination, which has already crept into the US, UK, Europe, along with the migration of people from India? Chrissy, are you still with us? I guess that's a question for you, Nikita.
Right. So absolutely, this is one of the, I mean, I pointed out, I focused mostly on the non-performativity of diversity and intersectionality, but there's of course been a very controversial discussion around how the focus is